important webinar, precisely because of the timing of the publication or the launch that we are going to go through. But because of the history that is recorded and the importance of how useful sometimes to record this history and make it available, because there are so many lessons that can be learned from this particular experience that is documented here. Given the reality that today we're faced with conflicts that are playing themselves out mainly in urban communities, in terms of the nature of the protests and sometimes the violence that visits the communities. But given the experience that we had in dealing with this kind of an experience in the past, during the transitional period that this book covers, I should believe that it is timely that it has come now, because I think even as a court, we are now beginning to refocus on empowering communities to build those centers of excellence that can begin to coordinate efforts to manage the current conflicts that we are faced with, not only in this country, but everywhere in this continent. Having said that, I would like to welcome all of you, but particularly with the panelists that we are going to listen to today. First, let me call upon Dr. LIZ to give us her opening remarks. Then I'll call upon Mr. J. Naidu and David Mercado to also respond. But welcome to all of you to this important webinar. Thank you. Dr. LIZ.
Thank you very much. Phil Mahlangu has put up a request permission to record. Could somebody deal with that, please? And then I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation. But first of all, I'd like to thank Accord and all of you for being here, and Accord for organizing this day, and Ambassador Nhlapo for chairing. So I'm going to start the PowerPoint now, and I hope that share screen will work. Can I share screen? I've got a notice saying host disabled, participant screen sharing. But I need to share the screen, please.
Sharon, can you intervene and help us in that challenge?
Liz, can you forward that through to Catherine and she would share on your behalf, please?
Can I do what?
Can you forward it through to Catherine and she would share it on your behalf?
Phew.
Yeah, forward the PowerPoint.
This is what I was asking for in preparation, but it didn't happen. It's a huge file. I'm not sure if it will forward, but I can try. It will take me a minute.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so it's to Catherine. So wait a bit. Let me get Catherine's email up.
Sorry, Liz, give me a moment. I'm going to make you a co-host and you will be able to share.
That's better.
Okay, there you go. Please try now.
All right, let me get out. Okay. Now I can't see the share thing. Okay. I've clicked share screen. And share. I've still got the notice, host disabled participant screen sharing.
No, it's shared.
It is
It is
shared.
shared.
The
Yes,
screen has
you
been
just-
shared. Thanks.
Peacemaking, peace
Can you see it?
building in South Africa. Yes, I
Yes.
see that.
Yes, we can see it.
But you
Okay,
need to, okay, there you go.
right. Let's
Yeah, I
hope
see.
that all. Let's
No, you can proceed, Doc.
Good. Okay. Right. Well, this is the title of the book, Peacemaking and Peacebuilding in South Africa. So I've tried to cover a fairly large sweep of history, but the focus of the book and most of it is all about the National Peace Accord signed on the 14th of September 1991. And there are three reasons why this was a historic document. First, it was the very first multiracial and multi-party consensus agreement in South Africa's history. Its signing cleared the way for constitutional talks in the form of CODESA to be very quickly organized and to open on the 20th of December. And it set up implementation structures to implement itself, and this was vital. There had been various sort of general intention documents to stop fighting and to start moving forward in a democratic manner, but they had not worked because they didn't have solid implementation structures. So the National Peace Accord created peace committees at national, regional and local levels and formed a safety net for the whole country that held and grew, mobilizing the people for peace up to and through the first democratic election, and indeed had the intention of continuing, but were unfortunately closed at the end of 1994. But this is the story of how those structures came into being and how they worked. So the background is the whole history of South Africa, and I will very quickly sketch how Archbishop Tutu's rainbow people came to be living together in this beautiful part of the world. Very briefly, as far as our knowledge goes at present, the inhabitants of Southern Africa for many thousands of years were the San or Bushmen, who were hunter-gatherers and artists who decorated caves with their paintings and spoke in click languages. And then about 2,000 years ago, various groups of Black people who were cattle-owning farmers migrated south from Central Africa to make their homes in the interior and down the eastern coast facing the Indian Ocean. The Western Cape, which we're looking at here with Table Mountain, developed a population of Khoi pastoralists who had cattle but were related to the San. White Europeans first made landfall in South Africa in 1488, seeking a trade route to the Spice Islands of Indonesia. And in 1652, the Dutch East India Company founded a vegetable garden here, where Cape Town now stands. And European immigration began at that point. The Dutch were joined by French Huguenot refugees fleeing from the religious wars in France via Holland, and by German farmers. And those people became the Afrikaners, literally Africans. They were Dutch-speaking and Protestant reformed in religion. They imported a large slave population from Angola and from all around the Indian Ocean. And the mixing of all these races created the colored or mixed race people, who are about 4 million today. And then in the 19th century, the British took over the Cape Colony. English settlers were sent to the relatively infertile Eastern Cape, and they expanded northwards through a series of frontier wars with the Xhosas. And meanwhile, the Zulu kingdom was formed under King Shaka in the north of what is now KwaZulu-Natal. and groups of Afrikaner farmers migrated north to find new land and to get away from British rule. On their way, they had bloody encounters with the Zulu kingdom. And when they survived, the Afrikaners came to see themselves as a race under the protection of God, destined to be rulers of the land. They went up onto the high grassland of the interior and formed two independent republics, South African or Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State. And meanwhile, the British began to colonize Natal and eventually to incorporate Zululand into Natal. And beginning in 1860, the British brought indentured laborers from India to work in the Natal sugar plantations, and Indian settlers followed them. And it was among the Indian population that Mahatma Gandhi worked for 20 years, from 1893 to 1914, defending their rights as British citizens. The right, for example, not to carry an identity book or pass. And this is where he developed his strategy of nonviolent resistance. So the British fought the Afrikaner republics in the Boer War, or Second South African War of 1899 to 1902, and modern South Africa came into being in 1910 as a country of 4 large provinces, a union of the British and Afrikaner colonies. It was given self-governing dominion status in the British Empire, the same status as Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and no Black people were involved in the formation of the Union, despite the fact that they had been qualified voters in the Cape Province. No Black people could participate in the National Parliament. The Afrikaner nationalists formed the National Party, which eventually came to power in 1948 with its policy of apartheid, absolute racial separation. So this map shows South Africa as it was after the grand apartheid splitting off of little bits of the country to become tribal homelands. And here in KwaZulu-Natal, you can see an archipelago of bits. In fact, there are many, many little bits assigned to KwaZulu. And then 4 of these homelands took the independence that Pretoria was offering, which meant they could have ambassadors and an army. Here's Transkei, Ciskei, and then right up at the top, Venda, and in 7 parts or so, Bophuthatswana. So derogatively called Bantustans. South African citizenship was removed from Black Africans, and they were expected to be citizens of that Bantustan, all of which were supposed to become independent, but not really independent. So just 4 did so. Apartheid made South Africa a pariah state, condemned at the UN. Armed resistance began after the shooting of unarmed protesters by police in Sharpeville in 1960. And about the same time, in 1961, South Africa became a republic and fell out of the Commonwealth. In the book, I've sketched this history of separation, but I've also laid emphasis on the resistance to it, the insistence on unity by both Black and white liberal leaders going way back to 1910 and beyond. And internal efforts at peacemaking included the multiracial resistance to apartheid that arose in the Defiance Campaign of 1952, the Freedom Charter of 1955, and finally the secret talks in the 1980s, both internally between the government and Mandela, who was in prison by then in Pollsmoor on the mainland, and externally, mainly in England, between the exiled ANC leadership and leading Afrikaner opinion formers. And these talks made possible the speech by F.W. de Klerk as the new state president on the 2nd of February 1990, announcing the unbanning of the liberation movements and the impending unconditional release of Nelson Mandela. Meanwhile, in the 1980s, a low-grade civil war had developed in KwaZulu-Natal. I put this up to illustrate the countryside of southern KwaZulu-Natal near Port Shepstone, Isingolweni, just inland of Port Shepstone. Hillsides dotted with little homesteads. And you see how very vulnerable they are, how you could creep up on them at night, whichever side you happen to be on. And the people who were fighting were basically ANC supporters, often youth, and the more traditional Zulus under the Inkatha movement led by Chief Buthelezi, which was politically in power in KwaZulu. So a low-grade civil war with origins, many different origins, but including industrial unrest and so on, had developed in the mid-1980s, a bloody conflict in KwaZulu-Natal. So at this moment in history, when Mandela was released, we have two interconnected conflicts, both with violence. One was the overall majority of the people throughout the country versus the apartheid government and its security forces, primarily the police, and the grassroots conflict in Natal KwaZulu between ANC supporters through the internal organization of the UDF mainly, and the ruling conservative Zulu cultural movement in Inkatha, led by Chief Buthelezi. So Mandela is released and the liberation movements are unbanned and began acting openly as political organizations. And two expectations follow Mandela's release. There will be peace now because Mandela and Buthelezi, who knew each other, will get together and sort out the conflict between them. And multiracial constitutional talks will soon begin in order to arrange the first democratic election. This didn't happen. Instead, in July 1990, Inkatha joined fully in the political battle by becoming the Inkatha Freedom Party and aspiring to be a national, a party of national influence and to take part in the coming constitutional talks. The low-intensity civil war spreads from Natal KwaZulu to the reef townships around Johannesburg and the Vaal. And bilateral meetings between the ANC and government just proceed slowly, violence increases, and there is no sign of multi-party constitutional talks. This reaches a crisis point in April-May of 1991, when the ANC threatened to pull out of all talks, and polarizations rise, and in the townships, this kind of violence is beginning to take hold. The picture, I think, is Alexandra with youth building little barricades to make it more difficult for police vehicles to move. And there is a war going on between the vast apartheid men's hostels, which have become fortresses for threatened Zulus and the Inkatha operatives who are supporting them, and pretty much the rest of the township. And everybody is distrustful of the police. So a mess and a crisis point in the top political echelons. And what happens then is that a remarkable group of business and church leaders come together. Separately, business and the churches had managed to form organizations through which they could take a progressive role in the transition. And at this moment, and I tell the whole story in the book, they managed to insert themselves into the political process and to become accepted as facilitators who can bring together representatives of all the parties, the government, Inkatha, the ANC Alliance, and a whole range of moderates, everybody, in fact, except the far right. And on the 22nd of June 1991, they managed to bring representatives together at Barlow Park, the corporate headquarters of the Barlow Rand Corporation, as it was then. And here they are, Professor Johan Haynes of the Dutch Reformed Church, who had done a great deal to bring the white Dutch Reformed Church to declare in 1990 that apartheid was, after all, a sin. Then on his left, we've got Lo Alberts, a scientist, scientific advisor to government, and a prominent Dutch Reformed layperson. Almost hidden behind Frank Chikane is John Hall, who became a director of Barlow Rand, who became the chair of the National Peace Committee. In front of him, Frank Chikane of the South African Council of Churches. Behind them, Bobby Godsall of Anglo-American. Then Jabu Mabuza of Black Business Development. The Reverend Kotsa Ngojo, the Natal Church Leaders Group and president of the Council of Churches. Ray Macaulay of Rhema, Charismatics. Desmond Tutu, Kerry Libber, representing the World Alliance the World Religions for Peace. And then Sean Cleary, a mediator working with business in KwaZulu-Natal, and he had worked with Jacob Zuma and Frank Mdlolozi in a remarkable holding operation for peace in KwaZulu-Natal. And then finally, Sam Motswenyane of Black Business Development. So these are the facilitators, and they have all the political representatives there. And in a meeting from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. that day, they agreed on the negotiation of peace agreements to be signed as quickly as possible. And it took 3 months of intensive negotiation, and the National Peace Accord was produced. It's a little booklet of 33 pages, 10 chapters. And these are the chapters. First of all, there's a preamble. Our common purpose is to end political violence. And in the principles, the people of South Africa agree for the first time that the establishment of a multi-party democracy in South Africa is our common goal. Chapter 2, very important, short, pithy, code of conduct for political parties and organizations. And in that chapter, which was a very fundamental chapter for the peace committees and for training the peace committees, there's a preamble about the importance of political parties in democracies, and then undertakings which are absolutely basic. No political party or organization or any official or representative of any such party shall kill, injure, apply violence to, intimidate or threaten any other person in connection with that person's political beliefs, words, writings or actions. We will not remove, disfigure, destroy, plagiarize or otherwise misrepresent any symbol or other material of any other political party, or interfere with anybody going to meetings, and so on. And then at the end of that chapter, very importantly, there was an undertaking to inform the appropriate authorities of the date, place, duration, and where applicable, routing of any public meeting, rally, march, or other event. And that was one of the clauses which led to the development of a new kind of peace monitoring, which was implementing the accord on the ground in a multi-party manner with the full involvement of the security forces, civil society, and the political parties in that area. And people were trained as peace monitors to do that. Then the security forces undertook a lot of things like wearing their name badges on their uniforms and painting numbers on vehicles, which were moving the police, as they wished to move at that time, towards a philosophy of community policing rather than repressive colonial style policing. And there's a police code of conduct to be agreed individually by each member of the police force. Then some measures to facilitate socio-economic reconstruction and development, which was quickly shortened to SERD. This involved relief for the victims of violence and also looking towards really community-based agreed development on a local basis. It was a kind of blueprint for the RDP later on. And that is all unfinished business to this day. And then the Commission of Inquiry, which became known as the Goldstone Commission, was legislated for during the same time that the accord was being negotiated. And it worked because it was incorporated as a structure under the peace accord and therefore was agreed by consensus within the peace accord. The National Peace Secretariat was set up to be statutory, government funded, and it had the responsibility to set up and service the regional peace committees and through them, the local peace committees. They were originally called dispute resolution committees, but were very quickly popularly renamed and then officially renamed peace committees. The National Peace Committee presided over the whole thing and was the source of consensus legitimacy. And there were measures for enforcing the peace agreement. Basically, that was by persuasion, and it did work. Though the press were always saying that the accord had no teeth. And then the idea that there might be special criminal courts to speed up political cases was replaced with other measures to speed up political cases. So 14th of September 1991, every party, including the ones ruling the homelands and so on, had 5 representatives. And the international diplomatic corps were there, the press were there, and the top leaders were there. De Klerk being greeted by Desmond Tutu. Behind them is Kobi Coetsee, who had led the talks with Mandela in prison. 23 people signed for 29 different organizations, including the government, Inkatha, the ANC Alliance, all parts of it, and so on. This is the only time in history that these 3, de Klerk, Mandela, Buthelezi, sat together. And at the end of the proceedings, Desmond Tutu gave the final prayer, but before he did so, he told a funny story, and I'm sure that's why they are laughing. The National Peace Committee was very quickly formed, and it nominated persons to serve on the National Peace Secretariat, which had its own multiracial committee, and was an incredibly hard-working little committee chaired by who is now Judge Anthony Gildenhuys. It never suffered walkouts or breakdowns, and it worked like mad to set up and support the 11 regional dispute resolution committees, peace committees. And in the end, there were 263 local peace committees. The National Peace Committee set up subcommittees for publicity, very important, and for socio-economic reconstruction and development to try to get something moving on that. It also nominated judges who might be appointed chair of what became the Goldstone Commission when Richard Goldstone was appointed, which has happened very quickly. The police board brought together experts on policing with the police generals and was a useful instrument in the transformation of the police at that time. The peace structures did develop over time. Functions tended to gravitate under the Secretariat because that's where the money came from. These are the 11 regions under the peace accord, and they more or less map onto the present 9 provinces. The TBVC states kind of remained outside this process, except that the Ciskei did kind of sign, and that whole story is in the book. So here's a typical sort of peace committee in the early days. Alexandra had descended into violence in 1991, and there were serious displacements in 1992, and that was when the peace structures were just hitting the ground. And this is the so-called Interim Crisis Committee, ICC, which kept its name because it had a kind of brand image. But it's the local peace committee for Alexandra on an away weekend funded by business, Nedcor. And we've got the ANC, IFP, various kinds of police and civil society all together. And this, what had happened was the peace structures offered for the first time an alternative to fighting, a real alternative with resources. And it was very important to monitor on the ground, to be out on the ground, and to get an understanding of exactly why people were being killed. And it was mostly defense of no-go areas and then revenge. So Christmas party, the IFP, an elder in the community on the left, and then reading across Miguel Alexander, who I believe is on this call, and Mike Beer of the ANC. This is jumping to when we had staff. There were no paid staff until the end of 1992, when the UN really said you have to do this. And these are the staff of the Orange Free State Regional Peace Committee. There were about 50 staff altogether, and this is their school photo over the election. Very well balanced in race and gender. And this is the Southern Free State and Welcome staff at that time. Publicity started straight away over Christmas of 1991. This was the first TV and press advert. And then in 93 came the peace staffs, which really caught the nation's imagination, and everybody wanted the T-shirt, and it became the brand image of the peace structures. So I've mentioned peace monitoring, and these are monitors in action in Katlehong on Sharpeville Day 1993, when the whole day had been jointly organized and then closely monitored during the time of 2 rallies, one ANC, one IFP, which were meant to be kept apart and to end 2 hours apart, but it rained and people were late, and the 2 processions, instead of being hours apart, were approaching each other, and there was an instant agreement that the peace monitors would stand between them so that there would be no contact and no great battle, which otherwise there very probably would have been. Shortly afterwards, another rally, it's an ANC rally, with a monitor, Victor Mpleni from Vosloorus. At this time, we had international observers coming to join the committees to support them from the UN, from the OAU at the time, sorry, from the EU and the Commonwealth. These are 3 police trainers who trained the party marshals. In the middle is a trainer from the London Metropolitan Police with 2 colleagues from Zimbabwe. again, the Commonwealth had quite an impact in parts of KwaZulu-Natal. This is Moses Anafu of the Commonwealth, who recruited a cousin of the king, Prince Maurice Madlala, and went around engaging the Amakhosi in peacemaking, beginning in Mbumbulu and with displaced youth near Port Shepstone. Publicity led to a national peace campaign, which really mobilized the whole country for peace. So Peace Day 1993, 2nd of September. This is in Thokoza, where there'd been serious violence since a rally went wrong on the 22nd of May. That was due to not keeping the peace accord. The police getting into the swing of things, and monitors, joint monitor party setting off on a peace walk.
Sorry, Reverend, how much time do you still need to wind up? We are running out of your
Okay,
time that is allocated.
I have about 3 more minutes. I'll run through the next,
Okay, thanks.
the last slide.
Sorry to disturb you.
Not at all. So, soccer for peace, balloons for peace, Miss South Africa for peace, new peace shirts for New Year 1994, 1 million of them, and peace is cool. And that was the whole thing, the whole point of the publicity campaign. Typical monitor unit. There were, by the time of the election, 20,000 trained peace monitors, and 18,500 were fielded over the election. And
only if we all work together and spread a message of peace can we build a future for our children.
okay, that's it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liz, for giving us that layout of the book and the remarks accompanying the pictures that we've seen, and a clear and vivid reminder of how we missed a situation that would have led to a civil war in this country. But also thanks for the historical background so that we can understand the challenge that we're dealing with at the time in its proper context,
Okay.
maybe including for purposes of our reflection today. I will now call upon Comrade J. Naidu, the First Secretary General of COSATU and the Minister responsible for the RDP, Reconstruction and Development Program in the government that was first cabinet of President Nelson Mandela. You've got 10 minutes, Comrade J. Welcome.
Comrade Welile, nice to be with you again, man. We are getting to be the next generation at the line, at the end of the line. So good to be with you all. Let's go very briefly through some thoughts that I have. First of all, as you did, Liz, thank you for so thoroughly researched and documented work, because it really is a legacy for the future, because these are not conflicts we'll encounter and then we'll see the end of. It's a continuing cycle of trauma, suffering, pain, and violence. But the 1980s were essentially a decade of intense ferment, a clash between Black resistance and white supremacy that reached a crescendo towards the end of the 80s. And in that process, people themselves on the ground built an inspiring mass movement in every sector of society, which later became known as the mass democratic movement, that involved thousands of organizations, some small, some large, some like COSATU were 1.5 million workers, but many were pretty small, but all acting in unison towards a shared vision. Simple demand: one person, one vote in a democratic, non-racial, non-sexist South Africa. And so, yes, while the 80s, was a period of intense repression with tens of thousands of people, arrested, many killed, many disappeared, our buildings bombed, including the headquarters of the South African Council of Churches and COSATU. The fact of the matter, the trade union movement was, in a sense, organized at the Achilles heel of the apartheid state. It could not sustain its edifice of repression if it could not, and it couldn't disrupt the tens of thousands of leaders we had built at a grassroots level. And that became, in a sense, a very important part of the backbone of the movement. But at the same time, sanctions was having an impact, and tightening up of the economy, and particularly not government sanctions, but people-to-people sanctions. I think thirdly, within the political underground, there started to be greater coordination between the banned organizations and the internal so-called legal organizations. And lastly, the issue of the armed struggle was important, not that we could militarily defeat the apartheid state and its army, but the notion of armed propaganda was an important part of keeping the flame alive. And I think finally the issue of the collapse of the Berlin Wall removed that specter of global communism and create conditions that presented a window of opportunity for a negotiated settlement. And although a huge abyss, separated us from our protagonists. And as trade unions, we had been negotiating for the past decade. We had built up pretty deep agreements with employers around collective bargaining and many other recognition agreements. So there was already, that coincided almost along the line of what Liz said as talks amongst talks between the ANC in exile and people like Mandela. So I think there was a recognition that we were in a state of paralysis, that stagnation, that they couldn't defeat us and we couldn't defeat them militarily. And so I think that with the civil war escalating, and particularly when they put restrictions on COSATU and essentially the country was under a national security management system, I think the intelligence services in particular began to see the beginning of the end. And so in a sense, they almost mentored the process of an engagement, even without the support of P.W. Botha and others like him. And so if you start to look at that period, violence didn't come just when Mandela was released. Violence has always been an inbuilt part of our system, both political and economic. But the violence between us and Inkatha in particular started in 1984, when the trade union movement in support of students in the townships, came out and struck. And that exploded it. And also there was an intense debate that we need to, in a sense, decipher. The notion that of warlordism and the notion of liberated zones. And I think both of those didn't fully understand the consequence of those actions. And we need a separate discussion to talk about that. But in the 1990s, when the CODESA process started, COSATU made a very clear decision to deploy certain people to negotiations, but people like mine were required to stay in the organization, because we understood negotiations. And negotiations was always the notion of give and take, but it was a relationship of power, ultimately. And we needed, as the mass movement, to be banging on the doors of those negotiators. And so when that violence broke out, of course, in that process of the 80s, we had built channels. I mean, the intention of trade unions was never to burn down a factory, although we were militant. It was to negotiate the best deal for the workers. And the trade union movement never thought of its members as the only constituency. Its constituency included their children, included townships, included women. And so the impact of COSATU at that point ran far beyond its numbers. And that's why the successful national strikes that it championed and it led. So if I look at what are the lessons that we've learned out of the National Peace Accord and why, well, the initial discussion was held between ourselves as COSATU and employers. And I can remember with Andre Lampek, who was a very senior negotiator for management and worked at Barlow World, a discussion around whether we could create a recognition agreement for dealing with the principles of freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of assembly, the core principles of freedom. And whether we could translate that not just a set of principles that leaders sign, but drill it down to the bottom, like we do, resolving issues at the lowest possible level. That's why the recognition agreement is about the election of shop stewards and setting up of negotiating committees and processes and protocols and procedures. So these were really important. And that, in a sense, was what we saw we needed to put into a process for building peace. But it was quite clear that COSATU was a protagonist in the violence. We were part of the war and aligned to the ANC. So from our point of view, we needed to create, to find who would be the right mediators to bring together the parties. And that's why, given our relationships with both the churches and our relationships with employers, we felt that the churches and employer associations would be key in creating an enabling environment. But that enabling environment had to set in place a set of important goals and important outcomes that we wanted. The first was building trust. All trust was broken in the country. So the idea of building what would be the confidence building steps that led to trust. The second thing, security. Of course, we saw the South African National Defense Force and the police, SAP, as an integral part of an orchestrated campaign of violence against us. So for us, we wanted greater security on police, on security. We want protocols. We wanted codified procedures, some of which Liz mentioned, because often the police will deny they're involved in violence. So we wanted big numbers painted on their trucks. Or we wanted to find a way in which we could identify who were the police involved at that particular moment of violence. Then there was the issue of trying not to aim at perfection. The idea that we had was be very pragmatic. Confidence is a step-by-step process. Take the first step. And we had tried to reach accommodation in Inkatha. In fact, we went to court in the mid-80s to charge, and in fact, won successful interdicts against key warlords in the Natal Midlands. But then when they came to court, a number of our witnesses were killed. We even went further to reach a political agreement with Inkatha. Frank Mdlalosi and ourselves, and bringing the churches and tried to negotiate a peace accord. None of that worked. And so we reflected on all of those lessons. And so important thing is inclusion. Leave no one behind. So the idea of inclusion, how it manifests itself, for example, if we wanted a march, we had to go into a police station with the station commander and all the political parties and agree the route, agree, the reason for the march. And so we preempt violence before it takes place in terms of the clash of the different components of the political sphere. The idea of creating community police forums, in fact, comes out of that. It was actually highly successful in bringing down violence in many of the hotspots that we had. But violence, we also had to analyze and decipher. Violence was criminal. There were people that were absolute criminals, political violence, ideological violence. There was competing needs of people. People wanted to wipe out their debts to the local shopkeeper. So suddenly that person will become an MPP to be killed. So I think these are areas of complexity that you can't find like one suit fits all, you know. So I think that for me, the important thing was a decentralization, solve the problem at the lowest possible level, and then graduate to a step and the next step and the next step. And so I think what was key in the National Peace Accord was beyond them signing on in that September 14, 1991, was what would be the mechanism we will build on the ground to hold the peace. And those were the peace marshals. I think one of the most radically important things that created a foundation and built bridges across the political divide, so that the peace marshals, even if they came from different political parties, at the end of the day developed an identity separate from their political parties. And so that was really important for us. And I think the importance of symbolism like in the form of the logo or the form of having a prayer service, you know, the symbolism of it became important. So I think that, why is that important today? I think we're very much in the same position, not just in South Africa, but globally. We're sitting in the moment of a perfect storm where we are facing an ecological catastrophe. We're facing a renewal of the geopolitical Cold War, and even with the threat of nuclear war and an arms race. And we're facing the real evils of a devastating increase in poverty, inequality, and hunger in the world. So we are facing a situation most recently reflected in what happened in July last year in South Africa, of violence breaking out. And this time, we do not have the grassroots leaders that we had in those times. We do not, there's a, you know, rather than it being black and white, there's a lot of gray in the area, in this field. And people that we could have relied on to lead us, you know, historically from our own movements, are now actually mainly discredited, and people don't trust them. If I don't trust them, I don't know how you expect anyone else in the country to trust them. So we're dealing with a massive breakdown of trust. And I think it's really intentional and good, Liz, that you focused our minds to go back to this, because we're just about to repeat that cycle of trauma that we had in the late 80s that we thought we would never see again. So my comrade, Ambassador, let me leave it at that, and we can have a discussion about it.
Thank you very much, Comrade Jay. I think your last remarks crown it all. I wouldn't want to dilute that by making any further comments on that one, because I think this is where we should zoom in and understand the context of the importance of this book launch. Last but not least, I'll call upon we come from the same township, so I know Slovo very well. And I hope he'll use the next 10 minutes to give us his own reflections about what happened. Slovo, can you come on, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Am I audible?
Go on, you are.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me, Dr. Liz. A couple of things that have been said by Mr. Naidu, former minister, when he spoke about you doing so much research. I remember the first time when we came through as COSAS, we had been used to seeing Dr. Liz moving around with one particular notebook and that handbag of hers. And we will always be saying, why is she always writing whatever that we are saying? Little did we know that that would be part of the package, part of the book that we are now looking at, that we now are reading. I know at the time I was also the secretary of COSAS in the province, and it was at that level that when I would report that in Alex, this is the case, comrades will say you need to be part of the system so that we can be able to correct those things, and that is how we got motivated to come through. And we ended that mentality of saying we don't want to be part of this program. There are a number of things that we learned out of that system. I know that there was one particular task group, which is the security task group. We used to say it's the TSG. You'd remember it, at least it was chaired by the late Dr. Thabo Mnisi. You would know him, Corporate Ambassador Thabo Mnisi, the doctor at Alex Clinic. We had the likes of Mampasha, Patience Pasha, those are the people that were there, LC cause, those are the adults that we came under, and we participated with them, and they were showing us the ropes. When there was additional violence amongst the taxi industries, those would be the people that would also come into the picture, and we would be asked to be part of that. And we learned how to deal with issues. One of the beneficiaries of that is me. I have benefited from the Peace Committee in such a way that I was told to go to programs that were presented, we were trained by IMSA, the Institute for Mediation of South Africa. I think it's something to that effect. You know, we did mediation, we did, I think it's there's if I may check, the dispute resolution and mediation skills, we got that from them. It is the Peace Committee that took us for leadership training courses with the SANDF. We actually thought that it was only to deal with issues around war and fighting, and yet there are other skills that one would get, and we did get those leadership skills from that. And it led us, the end result of the Peace Committees led to the Westvas Peace Secretariat creating the Peace Corps. I led a group of 100 individuals. We had groups, there were teams. We would patrol Alex and deal with issues. At some point, we ended up dealing with personal issues in their private lives, where we would mediate and do a lot. I know that we had a team of 10 individuals that would go around, would have areas, would use radios to communicate and so forth and so on, so that we were able then to assist those individuals. And as Mr. Naidu has indicated, this has actually led to a situation where we had strong CPFs. In Alex, I know as a former secretary for 13 years, we had so much skills that we had met individuals. Eventually, we were able to speak to the likes of Cummins Diesel, Toyota, we had SAP, being able to donate vehicles for the police to make sure that crime was going down. It is unfortunate that now, just 2-3 days ago, I think it's 2 days ago, we are looking at the states in terms of how our security is in Alex or across the country. You know, issues around violence against women and children. If the skills that we got during that time, we could be able to use them, we could deal with the scourge of this violence. GBV is one scourge that is not acceptable. And those skills are needed.
Sorry, David, kindly unmute.
Oh, my apologies. I speak with hands as well. So I'm saying the skills that we did get at the time, of being able to mediate, to be able to deal with dispute issues, should be the ones that assist us to come together again and start talking to the issue of GPV, because this violence against women and children, it's not working. We need these skills. If there could be anything that would have to be restarted, I think this book should be a stepping stone for us to say, history has taught us that we can be able to do one, to facilitating what we have learned and see if we cannot assist ourselves in getting a better future for our own children. Because my son, if he is to grow under these conditions now, without me assisting him to know what I have learned, the skills that I have got in terms of being able to speak to another person without being violent, the ability that we managed to get to be able to go into the hostel and speak to the indunas and come back and speak to our own comrades did assist us. At the time we were young, youthful, energetic, and wanting to do things differently. But light came, we then began to realize that it can only be in the boardroom that you can be able to assist another person to understand exactly where you are coming from, where you want to go. And violence is not necessarily the best solution in dealing with other issues. Hence, your CODESA and the likes. So there is a way that we can be able to assist. So we need to learn out of what we have received, what we are reading from here, to be able to say, let our future be different from what is currently the case. Because what we had at that time has actually been thrown out of the window. It has to come back. And I am one of those people that must be able to do that because I have been there. So I need also to find myself and say, having learned this, what is it that I'm contributing to? So that somebody else can be able to learn. So this book resuscitates what I have learned and says to me, you have learned 1, 2, 3, therefore go back and try and assist and see if people can be able to do things right without being violent. Let's have a better South Africa for our future generations. I think what is very important as well is to indicate that during that time, the hype of violence had seen us being able to look at people's eyes when they were, during that time of Beirut, you remember, Dr. Liz, the Beirut, when people were sent packing, they had to live in churches, in walls, and now they are residing in River Park. You start to remember those things and say, but this did happen. And one had actually forgotten. Then you are able then to find a way of saying, in the event that this was ever to happen, how can I be able to proceed? The skills that we learned as well have led to some of us participating in the IEC. You know, I am every time when there are elections, there is no ways that I'm not getting the call, say, are you still going to be the presiding officer in this polling station? And that has actually been because of the peace committee's involvement in assisting me to understand how to deal with issues. And when there were elections, I learned quite a lot, and I have consistently been using that skill up till today. So I am very grateful, Dr. Liz, for the work that you have put through. That notebook, I'm not sure now that you have written, whether that notebook has been thrown away or not, because there were lots of them.
Hello?
At that moment. Thank you so very much. And to you as well, Ambassador, you would know how we relate as Alex to the issues around violence. You know, it was easy to relate when Dr. Liz was putting it to paper, and you would start to think that we have gone a long way from where we are. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, for your remarks. I think they go a long way to capture the importance of what we are discussing today, the lessons learned and the need to be organized in order to respond to whatever scourge of violence that we are confronted with today. It is possible, it can still be done. The question of training is something that we need to take into consideration. We've been doing this on the basis of this experience as a court in the continent, and I think it's about time that as we had now decided to return back home, and we need people like you to help us organize the youth that will have to deploy to deal with some of the current challenges that we're faced with today. You ended up with a note that touches something very close to my heart. The people who have been displaced just across that Matala hostel. The first house just across opposite the hostel, that's my grandmother's house. And at the back, another grandmother. And across the street, the house I was born in. All of those houses are still occupied by people who left that hostel. So the problem is not yet over for some of us who go to River Park and see some of our relatives and children of people we know who were victims of that violence. So it's something that we can relate to. And we actually can relate to the importance of the role that we played by the peace committees in Alex. Thanks for that reminder. I'm just trying to check because of time now whether we will be able to take any questions or comments. But Catherine, can you advise me? Is there anything on the chat in terms of questions?
Hi, Ambassador. Yes, we've got one question. I think we have about 15 minutes for Q&A.
Okay, read that one out, and then we can get whoever is directed to respond. If no one in particular, then our panel will volunteer.
Thank you. It's for Reverend Liz, and it's from Ayesa Abubakar. I hope I pronounced your name right. It says, how did the peace builders, civil society, overcome the issue of religion and identity as part of conflict dynamics?
Hello. Well, religious diversity wasn't really an issue. We started every meeting with a prayer, and that was a Christian prayer, and that was expected. So in Alex itself, that wasn't an issue, if that is what you mean. Across the country, there was participation by Muslim leaders, mainly in the Cape, I think, and I think that was all very friendly. And today, I think that faith leaders would be able to get together. Towards the end of the launches, the consensus was usually in South Africa, and that was last month, October, when I was in South Africa doing launches. People sort of welcomed the book as the story of a social compact that worked and that had significant civil society leadership, both in getting it going and in serving on the peace committees and so on. And the conversation centers on what are the issues today. And they are issues of integrity in public life and competence in public life, and what might be done to promote those things. And might there be a national movement? Might the faith leaders be part of getting it going? Surely business leaders would be interested. And I was just last week in Philadelphia at the African Studies a conference, and we had a wonderful talk from a Nigerian economist and politician, a woman called Obi, and her name is Obiageli Ezekwesili, and she has started training in Nigeria and also for other countries on ethical leadership and bringing together character, competence and capacity. So that echoes very much what people have been saying in South Africa about the need for some kind of definite movement and training and thinking around integrity in public life and competence in public life. So I'm afraid that's wandered away from your question about religions, but all I can say is that they worked very well together where there was a diversity, and different Christian denominations worked very well together on the peace structures.
Thank you, Dr. Liz. Any further questions? I'll just start the.
May I say something on the last one?
Okay, please.
Liz, it is so nice to see you again, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really pleased that I could be here. On the question of the religion, I think it's important to bear in mind that for many of us, it was the whole peace structure and the peace activity and the dynamic was, in my case, certainly almost a defining part of my existence. You know, under the dispensation which predominated prior to that, you had very little contact with people from different groups. You lived in your own little cocoon. And I think one of the most valuable things about the National Peace Accord was that it brought people together to start communicating. And I think on the issue of religion, it was something of a revelation to me to find that there were people who had been, in my eyes and in my situation, had been in the opposition, more than the opposition, been the enemy. But yet on the religious level, they believed what I believed. And it made it the ludicrous situation that we had come out of was brought home to me in a different sort of way, because suddenly I realized that these people are they share my beliefs. Their fundamental beliefs, the fundamental things in their lives are like mine. And it really opened up a great deal in my own thinking. And it was a vehicle to greater understanding of the situation we found ourselves in the country at that stage. So I thought, seeing as the question was about religion, I would just mention that, because it played a huge role for me in the dynamic of the whole peace building exercise that we were involved in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mac. May I just add that is McGill Alexander, who, as Colonel Alexander, was in charge of the paratroops who came in at the same time as us when the Peace Committee was formed, became part of the whole process and really taught the police something about community policing in Alex. Thank you.
Can we have closing remarks from from our panel?
You know, just to add on this point, there's a really important point, because you know, the people that are involved here from faith-based groups, I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, it was the SACC that was our key partner. You know, they were the only ones willing and having the courage to stand up and open the churches when we had strikes or, you know, big actions. And then, I mean, Archbishop Tutu, when our headquarters was bombed, the COSATU headquarters, you know, he invited me into his office and said, well, just find a few officers here and start operating. So the idea of bombing our headquarters was to disrupt our logistical operation. And then he's he's building a bomb, the Kotso house, you know. So I think that the church has played a really fundamentally important role. And it all goes back into, I think that defining moment was 1985, and it was the Kairos document. And that becomes an important thing in the journey of each of the stakeholders to where we eventually said, you know, how do we rise above our constituencies and our prejudices and our views and start to find the common ground? And that's what led into the negotiations. You know, otherwise the negotiations were so adversarial. You know, the National Party wanted minority rights, and the ANC, we wanted one person, one vote. I think the second element that I think that really important was the notion that socio-economic reconstruction has to be the flip side of making peace. And there, I think we failed miserably. And we need to go back, because at the end, Liz, you are right to say, in a sense, it influenced our thinking into the Reconstruction Development Program. And the importance of Reconstruction and Development Program, or the reconstruction efforts at the level of where communities are devastated, is to provide a light at the end of the tunnel. No one in this country, even the poorest of people, thought that we will solve everything in 5 years. And that's a misnomer. But they said there's something that holds us together, a social consensus, what comes out of the work that we did through the National Peace Accord. And it was holding a light that maybe a generation or 2 generations, we will build a more inclusive society. What has happened? We've become an even worse pariah than the pariah we were under apartheid. Now a pariah of inequality, under our own rule, under democracy. So if you ask yourself the question, why half the Black youth in our townships don't even bother to register for our elections, something that generation after generation would have died for, then we should learn to point the fingers at ourselves. We are responsible. And I think if we could get out of this conversation and a subsequent conversation, what is it can I do to change this? Whether I'm an elder now in my near 70, or whether I'm a young person coming out of school. That's the social consensus that builds social cohesion. And I don't hear that from any political party. I don't hear that from many people in this country today, except individuals and real grassroots people. So thanks very much, Liz. I'm glad that you're allowing us to put these issues, which we didn't resolve in 30 years, back on the table.
Thank you. May I mention President Cyril Ramaphosa has been in Britain for the last couple of days. I met him on Monday briefly. I showed him the book. He was very interested, and he was given the book at the Guildhall banquet last night. So hopefully he might be enthused as well.
Thank you. Slovo, can you make your last remarks? If you are still around.
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much. The important thing now will be for one to take up the challenge. I think both of yourselves, Mr. Naidu is the latest to say that. You said it earlier, immediately after I had spoken, that Accord does some work. It's up to people to join in and see where is it that they can fit in and do something. I am going to take that as a challenge that I need to consider, so that I am less talking and more actioning, because this is an opportunity for me to do. There is a platform that I can be able to, even though I am age distant away, there can be things that I can be able to be assisted with in terms of how things can be done. So I am going to find a way of following up with Catherine and see how able am I to contribute the little that I can be able to. I think it's best that we follow through without just saying too much, but acting, so that we are able to say, this is what we are doing, as opposed to this is what I would like to see. So action will have to be the name of the game.
Yeah,
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all our panelists and all of those who joined us online. Hopefully, we should all be able to access the book so that it can be distributed as much as possible. And think particularly within our schools and wherever the opportunity is, to use it as a reference and a guide to us dealing with the challenges that we're facing so that we can remember where we come from. Because some of these things are just mentioned without any meaningful reflection and understanding. Today, when people talk about RDP, they're talking about poorly built houses.
Yeah.
And it was a whole reconstruction and development program that had to deal with our past and for us to be able to continue to organize ourselves and reflect on all the challenges, using all the resources to make sure that freedom has meaning, that the peace dividend can be palpable. And I think as Comrade Jay and Slovo had said, we are where we are today in a situation that we cannot be happy and proud of. There are things we can be proud of, but there are others in the much part that we cannot be. You know, when Oliver Tambo declared 1980 the year or the decade of freedom and emphasized the point of organization and leadership on the ground in South Africa and internationally. Perhaps for others it was taken lightly, but for the majority of people, Comrade Jay and the others, and a lot of people internationally, that message sank. And our own actions on the ground and the retreat of the apartheid regime encouraged us and encouraged everybody to search on. People have not lost faith in us even today. Let us rekindle the torch and save our country. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you. God bless you. And there are instructions about ordering the book. I sent them out to my own lists, and perhaps they could be sent out from Accord. And thank you, Dithari from Blue Weaver, for being present on this call.
Thank you, Dr. Liz, for the gift to the people of South Africa and this continent, and to the world, indeed.
Thank you very much. I pray blessings on everyone who reads it.
Thank you. Goodbye to everyone.
Goodbye.